Thank you, Marie. Let me introduce Dr. Richard Compton. He is the Director of Behavioral Safety Research at the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration for the U.S. Department of Transportation. For the past 37 years at NHTSA, he has directed and authored numerous research studies in the areas of safety and driving. He is currently responsible for directing NHTSA's behavioral safety research program that encompasses such topics as drugs and impaired driving, young drivers, and unsafe driving actions. Thank you, Dr. Compton.
Okay. Good afternoon. It's interesting, one of the people that came in a little later, Steve Gust here from NIDA, I remember I collaborated with him on a study, I think it was with marijuana back in 1982, so I have been at this for a while. Okay, I was asked to talk about the role of cannabis use in motor vehicle crashes, and I'm sometimes accused of talking too much. Let's see. Okay, so in this slide, I present you my conclusions. So it's all here on one slide. The question is, do we know the role of cannabis in motor vehicle crashes? And the answer is, the available research to date has produced quite conflicting evidence and very divergent estimates of risk. In fact, many studies have not shown any risk. So that's it in a nutshell, and I'm going to elaborate a little bit on that in the rest of my time. There are actually quite a few things we know about the use of cannabis and driving and even risk of crash involvement. So some of the things we know. We know that cannabis impairs driving-related skills. There's been actually quite a bit of research involving laboratory studies on psychomotor performance, simulator studies of driving, instrumented vehicles where people dosed on marijuana have measurements made. And there are some very consistent findings on these driving-related skills showing impaired performance. In all fairness, there also are some driving-related skills that appear to be enhanced by the use of cannabis. And I'll just mention some of those. One thing I think one can conclude at this point based on the available research is if we compare the risk of driving under the influence of cannabis to some other impairing substances like alcohol, it pales in comparison. There's absolutely no question the risk is much, much smaller, if any. Okay, so driving-related skills, I suspect a lot of you have heard a lot of this already, so I'll just be very brief. I mean, I have listed a few things here that quite a few studies have repeatedly shown. So people who use or are under the influence of cannabis have slower reaction time. This is quite relevant to driving, of course, because you need to be able to respond to unexpected events, emergency braking, and so on. Probably the most consistent finding is something known as lane variability. As you drive down the street, you don't stay in the exact same position in your lane. There's a little bit of wobbling. It's usually measured by the standard deviation of lane position, and I think almost every study that measures this finds a statistically significant increase in SDLP. It also affects your ability divided attention. As everyone knows, marijuana, cannabis, has cognitive effects on information processing and divided attention, and effects on executive functions, which are relevant for route planning, decision making, and judgment, risk taking. So these are all viewed as sort of impairments of driving related skill. On the other hand, in these studies, what you typically find is that people under the influence of cannabis drive slower. Okay? If you dose someone on alcohol, they drive faster than when sober. Dose them on cannabis, they tend to slow down. If you look at the distance that they follow a vehicle, because most of the time you're not driving with no other cars on the road. Okay. You dose someone on alcohol, they follow closer. You dose them on cannabis, they follow at a greater distance than they would when sober. Dose someone on alcohol, they take greater risks. Dose them on cannabis, they take fewer risks. Most investigators like to speculate that this is a form of compensation. There's always demand characteristics when you're a subject in an experiment and you want to show you can, hold your alcohol or drive well even after smoking marijuana. So I don't know. I mean, I assume some of this probably is compensation. And obviously, in the real world, compensation is not always going to be 100% successful. Okay, so what are the implications of all this research? Well, I'm not getting this thing to move along. Okay, back here. There we go. What does it all mean? Does this prove marijuana has significantly raised the risk of being in a crash? And I would conclude not necessarily. Most of this stuff, the laboratory research, the simulator research, the instrumented vehicle, these are very controlled experiments. Okay, they involve precise measurement, often with repeated measures. And in this kind of research, especially with repeated measurements, it is very easy to find statistically significant effects. They are often tiny. The often cited increase in lane variability, standard deviation of lane position, you may find the variance going from 3.7 centimeters to 4.2 centimeters. Now, you have to ask yourself, what is the implication for the likelihood of being in a crash as a result of this, given to the population norm and the range of variability? And the answer is, there is no implication. You cannot translate this kind of controlled research into predicting crash involvement. These very tiny effects, which are reliable, they're repeated, shown in study after study, they're statistically significant, really can't inform you about actual real-world crash risk. Okay. So, there are other approaches that have been used to try to estimate the risk of getting in a crash under the influence of cannabis. They have strengths, they have weaknesses. I'm just going to mention three here. One is what's known as responsibility analysis or culpability analysis. There are more epidemiological population-based methods and what are known as case control studies. Okay. So under responsibility analysis, you look at crashes and try to determine the responsibility of a driver involved in a crash, because some crashes are single vehicle, the driver obviously is at fault. But many of the crashes are multi-vehicle and not every driver is at fault of causing the crash. So you calculate the odds ratio of drug-positive drivers, the rate at which they're at fault, to drug-free drivers. So you can do this for those who are positive for THC. This is a method actually that works very nicely with alcohol. You get this great correlation. So it's a form of validation. Unfortunately, THC levels aren't like BAC levels, so it really doesn't work that well for marijuana. The other next method is population-based estimates. And again, you're calculating odds ratios here of crash-involved drivers compared to non-crash-involved drivers. A typical scenario is to take crash-involved drivers who were injured and transported to hospital. And you draw a blood sample and you look for the presence of THC. And then you take a control sample of non-crash-involved drivers and you do the same thing. You try to estimate the percentage that are THC positive and you calculate your odds ratio. The challenge here is actually getting equivalent samples with all of the appropriate controls, and this is very difficult to do. And I'll say a little bit more about that. I wanted to go on to the case control method, which I think is probably the best method and it has its own limitations, where you're trying to calculate the risk by comparing crash involvement, or THC positive drivers who are crash involved, to similarly exposed non-crash involved drivers. This method tries to control for bias when the non-crash involved drivers differ in fundamental ways from crash involved drivers. This is important because not everybody has the same risk of being in a crash. There are many factors that are well known to affect crash risk. So for example, young drivers, teenagers, 20-year-olds, they crash much more frequently than middle-aged drivers, about 7 times more often. And then we have that funny little thing about males. Males crash much more often than females do. I mean, this has been well known for decades. A lot of crashes occur at night. They occur on the weekend. There are many different variables that affect crash rates. Even for completely sober, large population groups, they're not equivalent. And you need to control for this. And a lot of these so-called case control studies that have been done do not actually control for these variables. Let's see. I'm going to talk just very briefly about a study we recently completed. It was a very large, difficult endeavor of doing a crash risk study looking at drug positive, alcohol positive, and drug and alcohol using drivers for 75 different potentially impairing substances. And this came from an earlier study we did 15 years ago where we just looked at alcohol, and we came up with this nice curve showing the relative risk of crash involvement by BAC. So even at something like 0.08, you are 400% more likely to get in a crash than sober. At a 0.10 BAC, it's 8 times. By 0.15, it's like 14 times. I mean, these are huge increases in the likelihood of being in a crash. So, this study, we actually responded to crashes. We got biological specimens, we got breath, we asked for oral fluid and blood from crash-involved drivers. And we had researchers riding around with police officers for 20 months in a community so that as soon as the officers arrived at the scene of the crash, our guys could try to get these samples. We also got samples from those who were arrested, those who were transported to hospital. We chased the ambulance to the hospital to try to get consent for a blood draw. We did this 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We had teams operating. In one community, this was actually done in Virginia Beach, Virginia. They were very, very cooperative. It was pretty much of a random sample of crashes. We did exclude people under 16 because of consent issues. You can't draw blood from people that age. Commercial vehicles we didn't go after. The drivers had to speak English or Spanish. And then we had issues, of course, with the IRB that for people who were clearly impaired, they cannot give informed consent, so we couldn't use them either, or in emotional distress. Okay. So, I'll skip this. It's way too much detail. We ended up with actually an interesting distribution of crashes that mirrors the national numbers my agency collects. So we had about 15 fatal crashes during this 20 months in this community. 886 injury crashes that involved transport to hospital, and the rest were property damage crashes. And these are roughly the same percentages that we get nationwide. So it was a nice representative sample of crash-involved drivers. This slide really is just showing you that we got surprisingly good participation rates. Okay. So if you'll get down to the last row there, you'll see that our crash-involved drivers, 82% gave us an oral fluid or blood sample, and almost 94% of the control drivers gave us one. The control drivers, we went back to the precise location of a crash 1 week later. So we were matching based on day of week, time of day, location of crash, and even direction of travel, which I think is highly significant in doing this kind of work. Okay, this talks about the special ones. I skipped that. So this is the BAC curve. This is the first thing we did when we got our hands on the results, just to see if it matched previous curves or we got some screwy sample. The red line is the one I showed you from the study 15 years ago. The blue and green lines are from the current study, and they matched really nicely. The purplish one was the first time we could actually look at the effects of alcohol excluding other drugs, because in previous studies you just did a breath test, you didn't know if they were impaired by multiple substances, and lots of people use multiple substances. Okay, so let's get to the meat of it. The first line here is THC positive drivers. You'll see that 7.6% of the crash involved drivers were THC positive and 6.1% of our controls. So if you stop doing your analysis at this point, you'd say, well, there was this statistically significant greater percentage of crash involved drivers that are THC positive. You could calculate an odds ratio. Again, look at the first line, and you'll see that the odds ratio for THC positive drivers is 1.25, representing a 25% increase in likelihood of being in a crash. Here we have adjusted for demographic variables. We've taken out the effects of age and gender. Now, who gets in crashes? Young drivers, male drivers. Who uses marijuana? Young males. Okay, so you need to control for these sorts of things. So we took out four demographic variables we had. And you'll notice the odds ratio is now down to 105, and then when we adjusted for the presence of alcohol and took out the effects of alcohol on crash involvement, the odds ratio actually went right down to 0. This surprised me. I was always convinced marijuana increases the risk of being in a crash, but this is what we found. Virtually no evidence it increases the risk. So there have been studies. I think it's common to see low estimates of risk, or that marijuana use doubles the risk of being in a crash. There have been some studies, like in the Netherlands, that said it was protective and it reduced the risk of being in a crash. As I said, they're all over the map. I think most of those were poorly controlled, so I'm going to stake my hand on this study right now as our best estimate. I'm done.